Hello, good evening, and a warm welcome to everyone. So, before we get started, a little introduction about Takshashila and, of course, the discussants and the panel for this evening. Um, a brief intro, like I said, the Takshashila Institution is a network think tank and a school of public policy. We're located in Bangalore and have been operating since 2010. As an independent, non-partisan policy research think tank, we are engaged in India's relationship with the world, transforming how India is governed and exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. Now take a look at our public policy education programs. It's available on our website and they're tailored specifically for people like you. And they're all online and you can take them from anywhere. We run both one semester programs as well as year-long graduate programs, and specializations are in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology and policy, and health and life sciences. Admissions are open throughout the year, so you could come in for the next intake. And to stay connected with us, do subscribe to our newsletters and listen in to our podcast. And depending on your interests, we deliver sharp and timely analysis that allow you to reduce information overload, of course, and to get to the heart of the matter. Now, for this evening, we have an interesting panel, and I take pride in saying most of them are our alumni, and we have our author Zeeshan as well. So just a little bit of an introduction. We have Gaurav Jabulee, who's our GCPP alumnus. So he's going to be the host for today. And we have an interesting panel combination of Naraayan Kannan, and he's the senior VP at CPPR Private Limited. We also have Deepali Dewan. She's the research analyst at the CPPR. And we have Ruturaj Gowaikar, who's the research scholar at IISc. So welcome the panelists as well as attendees, and thanks for being there this evening with us on a Friday evening. And over to you, Gaurav.
Thank you, Soumya, and thank you all for joining us. So today we will speak to Mohamed Zeeshan about his new book, Flying Blind, India's Quest for Global Leadership. Zeeshan, to introduce him, is the editor-in-chief of the Freedom Gazette, and he's also a columnist and a consultant on foreign affairs. He's a staff writer for the Diplomat magazine, and he also writes on a regular basis for the Sydney Morning Herald, for the Straits Times, the South China Morning Post, and our own Deccan Herald, among others. Zeeshan is a master's in international affairs from Columbia University, and his work experience includes stints with the Indian delegation at the UN in New York, and also as a consultant with the global consulting firm Kearney in the Middle East, where he advised multiple governments on economic and political modernization initiatives. So welcome, Zeeshan. Again, Flying Blind is Zeeshan's first book, and it's a much needed critical examination of the traditional practice of foreign policy in India over the past many decades. So looking at the opportunities and threats facing India in the emerging multipolar world, Zeeshan articulates some very refreshing, original ideas that Indian policymakers should consider as India seeks to grow its influence globally. So Zeeshan, to summarize, the key ideas that you're advocating in the book are twofold. Firstly, that India should seek to enhance its global influence by sharing its experience of building institutions and governance in a democratic framework. And secondly, that India should avoid fence sitting if it wishes to earn a seat at the table in key international fora, and that India should not hesitate to articulate a key stance on international issues. So would you care to elaborate a little bit on this, Zeeshan?
So thank you so much, Gaurav, for so kindly introducing me. I'm extremely honored and privileged to be here with all of you at the Takshashila Institution, whom I've been fairly well acquainted with for the last couple of years. And I'm quite glad that we've gotten together here to talk about my book. I must be honest, I make some extremely unconventional arguments in my book. And I start out by talking about why I want to write about Indian foreign policy, or why Indian citizens, the average Indian citizen should care about foreign policy. And that is where the story of influence comes from. I think that it's quite odd and strange that a country as large as India and as consequential as India has, rather poor ratings on various indices and surveys on global influence. In my book, I talk about a couple of few surveys that show that India's influence is not quite, at par with its size and consequence. And I also talk about the Henley Passport Index, amongst other things, where India actually ranks extremely low, below the likes of Brazil and China and even Zimbabwe, for that matter, in terms of the travel freedom that the Indian passport, affords Indian citizens. Now, a lot of this has to do with the absence of proper bargaining chips for Indian foreign policy. And therefore, we are unable to really influence other governments to conduct policy in a manner that would fulfill common interests, but also the interest of the Indian people. And that is where I come from. I think that it's extremely important for us to realize that foreign policy, in many ways, touches the lives of farmers and fishermen and factory workers, apart from the students and professionals and working laborers around the world, in the Middle East, in North America, Europe, and so on. We've got the raging fishermen water sharing dispute with Sri Lanka that's been going on for several years. We've got obviously the issue of running trade disputes with various countries, keeping the interests of our farmers and others at heart. And my question, quite frankly, is why is it that India, despite its size and consequence, is not able to negotiate with other countries in a way that its passport is stronger, that its fishermen do not need to quibble with those in Sri Lanka every day, that our farmers do not need to worry so much about the returns that they get on trade deals and so on, so much so that India has to sit outside of trade negotiations because we're not able to get our way, whether it is with our CDP or with the US or the EU or other countries that we have been negotiating trade deals with for a very long time. So a lot of this for me boils down to the question of influence and the fact that India is not able to influence other countries during these negotiations because India does not have enough bargaining chips. Now, that brings us to the question of how do we build influence? And that is where fence sitting for me has been a big problem. We cannot build influence if we are not useful to other countries. We need to stand up in many ways for the interests of various lobbies and interest groups around the world in different countries. We need to stand up for what they care for, sometimes even if that is not entirely within the domain of what we see as our narrow interest. So I talk about the issue of Africa and Latin America, where India does not have anything to lose, but we have plenty to gain by speaking up for the voices of other people. And in doing so, we end up becoming important to them. India becomes important to their welfare. The welfare of India becomes important to these countries and these interest groups. And as a result, we end up building influence around the world. Whereas if we sit on the fence, as we tend to do on various sensitive international issues, as we do today, we are not speaking up for anybody, and therefore we are not relevant on most burning international questions of the day.
Thank you, Zeeshan. And I think there are some questions that I have based on the thought-provoking ideas that you just articulated. Before I come to that, I just also want to remind the audience that you can always keep asking your questions in the chat box. What we will do is after I've asked Zeeshan a few questions and the discussants have asked him a few more, we will then have some time for your questions as well. So please keep the questions flowing in the chat box. So Zeeshan, you talked about growing our influence, and it is okay to say that India should grow its influence and have a seat on the table. But shouldn't this be more purposeful and directed? For example, does growing our influence on issues or areas concerning the Middle East or Africa, which you talked about in your book, and you've given examples such as the Central African Republic, you've talked about Palestine and Syria, does doing that or growing our influence in those places create any substantive outcomes for India, or is it just a tangential interest, right? And the second part of that question would be, why not focus decisively on growing India's influence in places which matter for our security and economy? So that would be places like South and Southeast Asia. It would be the Indian Ocean Rim in proximity, and afar it would be places like the EU and the US and maybe Russia, right? So it would be good to have your thoughts on this.
No, this is a very valid question. I think it's something that a lot of people ask. But for me, and as I articulate and explain in my book, I don't think it's an either-or situation. There are a few points based on why I say that. One, I think, if you look at India as a country, it's one of the most global countries in the world. I talk about the fact that the Indian diaspora is spread out around the world. There is a person of Indian origin or an Indian citizen in every country in the world except for 3. And so as a result, a lot of what we think as faraway conflicts in Libya or Yemen are not actually all that far away. There are Indians that are caught in the crossfire in these countries every day, which is why the Indian Air Force is having to conduct such very heavy, highly expensive, highly skilled, multimodal operations to evacuate them from these places. And what's sad is that while we are doing that, and even as a service for other countries that have their own citizens stuck there, we don't really have a seat at the table. We don't have a voice on what's going on. We are quite often caught napping, if I may say so, in that we react to events rather than proactively trying to shape them before they actually explode. And that, I think, is what I'm trying to change. The other part of what also comes to my mind is that, it's not an either-or question, because a lot of what goes on in South Asia is also not all that far removed from these other parts of the world. And for me, the central objective should be to build influence by doing what matters to the rest of the world. And, to countries like America, the UK, the EU, China even, or Japan and others who also have globalized economies like our own, things that happen in Africa or in the Middle East are also quite often important because they do threaten their own national security. You've got, of course, America that has been struggling in the Middle East for a number of years now, due to the terrorist threat that they see emanating from that region. And obviously, we do want America's cooperation in a lot of what goes on in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And I think that we need to start thinking about whether we can collaborate with America or become influential in other parts of the world like Latin America or Africa that matters to America in a way that would make America, in some sense, compel America a lot more to act in India's interest in these other parts of the world, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on, that are a lot closer to India itself. So I think it is a question of building a grand strategy that is consistent and coherent, so that we are not really contradicting ourselves, because what happens as soon as a rising power contradicts itself by doing one thing in South Asia and another thing in Africa or the Middle East, is that we become less trustworthy. Countries are not sure whether India is going to stick to its line when the next election comes or when the next year comes. And so as a result, they're also not able to collaborate with us or build a certain level of trust with us, today for what we say and what we do.
Mm-hmm. And so you talked about India having a seat at the table, right? And that being something that is important in terms of growing influence. There is also a counter view where people sometimes ask if tokenisms such as a UN Security Council permanent membership matter that much, right? Or alternatively, can the accumulation of power and the willingness to use it to pursue our interests anyway, right, result in us enjoying a de facto veto over decisions on international issues, right? So then the question becomes, should India really expend its political capital and energy pursuing a UN Security Council membership, permanent membership, for example, or other similar initiatives, right? Or should India simply disregard or downgrade its engagement with global multilateral institutions and focus instead on bilateral partnerships and regional and other groupings, right? Examples being G20 or ASEAN or Quad, where we have a say, right? So what would your response to that be?
No, this is a very valid point. And I actually asked this question in Flying Blind as well, whether India's obsession with the Security Council and a seat at the table is really overdone. And I do give examples of other countries that have managed to, in some sense, build influence outside of, these councils simply by being relevant to. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technical glitch. Just give me a second, and I'll be right back.
Sure. We can hear you fine, by the way. So yeah.
Okay, I think that my video is having a little bit of an issue, but it should be back in a few seconds. And I think, for me, it's very interesting to see as I write my book that India sort of takes this permanent seat at the Security Council a lot more seriously than other aspirants for a seat in the Security Council. For instance, I talk about how the Indian Permanent Missions website, has listed Security Council reform as one of the most major issues that India cares about at the UN, whereas other countries like Germany and Japan and Brazil have only listed them as one of several issues in UN reform. So India does take it more seriously than any of the other aspirants for a seat at the table in the Security Council. The Indian Prime Minister tends to talk about it a lot more often. We had that happen again quite recently when India became a non-permanent member of the Security Council quite recently. Indian diplomats talk about it a lot more often. But I do also think that there are, as I write my book, a lot of concomitant benefits to being on the Security Council, apart from the fact that, of course, you're there, and so whenever something breaks out in Yemen or Libya or Iran or Syria or elsewhere, India is able to understand the conflict as it happens. We're privy to developments as they take place, and so we're able to, essentially respond to them a lot more effectively and a lot more quickly than we might have otherwise. And at the same time, I also think that the veto itself is a bargaining chip. And in my book, I talk about the example of Russia that has used its veto quite effectively as an element of its national power in countries like Syria and so on. And so it's a very useful bargaining chip for permanent members of the Security Council. But the other side of this, as you said, is that this is kind of overdone, and there have been countries in the past that have managed to, have more of an influence on conflicts around the world without being in the Security Council, because they took a stance on these issues. They built purposeful alliances with countries both inside and outside of the Security Council, and as a result, they became relevant to the debate that was going on in the Security Council. And when the Security Council sat together to write and draft resolutions, what these countries were doing was quite important to the work of the Security Council, and they were able to drive the agenda and the narrative. So it is somewhat I will say complicated. It's not a black and white answer. There are obviously a number of advantages to being in the Security Council as a permanent member, but on the other hand, it's not really going to mean very much if you're not also building your influence in a way on the outside that makes you in some sense relevant to the business of the Security Council. There are a couple of further points that I want to make on this issue because I think it's very important, and both of them are also explained in more detail in my book. One is the fact that if India is serious about becoming a permanent member of the Security Council, that is going to be an extraordinary effort to reform the UN. And there are several reasons for why, procedural and otherwise, why this is very, very difficult to do. And in some sense, the only way that India can do this is by, in some sense, becoming more important to international security than the Security Council itself. Insofar as that, the Security Council itself cannot function effectively without counting India as a member at the table. And there have been countries in the past, as I said, that were outside the Security Council, who became important to Security Council business in different countries and conflicts, and actually, as a result, were also invited to be members of the Security Council when those issues were on the agenda and they were being discussed. Of course, they don't have voting rights, but their voice still counts at the table and it is heard. And the other thing that also comes to mind is that if you look at the work that the Security Council does, you asked about Africa earlier, that's why I'm making this point. A majority of the Security Council's business is actually in Africa. 2/3 of the Security Council's business is in Africa. And the majority of Indian troops under the UN peacekeeping flag are also in Africa. And so if India is not relevant and active in African conflicts, then there really is not too much of a case that India can make in terms of being relevant to Security Council business. And so the question then needs to be asked, why other countries would actually campaign for India to get a seat at the Security Council on a permanent basis, have the veto and have all of these tools of influence if India's own conduct as an emerging power is not quite clear to them.
Sure. So going back to one of the other central themes of the book, right, and a very interesting idea that India should try to seek to enhance its global influence by sharing its experience of building institutions and governance in a democratic framework. One counter question that could be asked about that is, given that India itself has vast governance deficits, right, especially at a state and local level, does India even have the capacity or the institutional capacity to help others build institutions?
Well, yes and no. And I answer both sides of this question in my book. The yes part of it is that, the countries that I'm looking at are quite often a lot more backward or less developed in some sense than India is in terms of state building and democracy. I think the Indian democracy and the Indian democratic setup is something quite incredible. There are really no countries in the post-colonial world of India's size and complexity that have managed to do this, or anywhere close to India's size and complexity. I'm leaving aside the likes of Singapore and others that are quite smaller, and South Korea in some sense a lot more homogeneous, and started off as an authoritarian state and then became a democracy over a period of time. But if you look at the likes of the Central African Republic, of Zimbabwe, of Tanzania, of Ethiopia today, all of these countries that became independent around the time that India became independent or shortly afterwards, they are far, far behind us in terms of building a credible, stable, functioning democracy. And India already has the apparatus within the foreign ministry to actually do this. As early as in the days of Lal Bahadur Shastri himself, India was conducting what was called the ITEC, and it still is a thing today, which basically conducted consultancy operations, gave advice to other countries around the world that were trying to build their institutions, particularly post-conflict fragile states and so on, that were trying to build their institutions. And the argument that I make in my book is that India tends to do this in a somewhat ad hoc manner. We tend also not to involve ourselves on sensitive political issues where actually countries like India can play a role. And also we tend to do this on a bilateral level, whereas if we did it on a more multilateral scale, then the impact of these programs will be much more in terms of growing India's influence. But also I think that what I describe in my book is not so much India lecturing to the rest of the world. What I want to see India build is a sort of a knowledge sharing, capacity building network, which, you mentioned the G20, for instance, the WEF also does this, the World Economic Forum. They're essentially knowledge sharing, capacity building networks where solutions are developed for various developmental challenges. But they tend to be very exclusive, as we know, and for strange reasons, the countries that would most benefit from these operations and programs, which would be low-income, middle-income countries, are actually left out of a lot of these groups. And if India builds a platform, I would like that to be a lot more inclusive, much larger in scale, and it would be in some sense more like India actually taking and taking lessons from other countries on what works for them, and also sharing lessons to them on what works for us and what might work out for them, and do this in some sense in a manner that would make India a development partner in the journeys of half the world, as I describe it, rather than India actually standing up on a high horse and lecturing down to the rest of the world. What other countries like America have done in the past, and quite frankly, it has not worked. But India, being a developing country, sharing a lot of the same challenges that these other countries face, grappling with the same diversity in identity and political groups that these countries have. A lot of these countries like Nigeria and others look to India and say, well, how does India manage to do this?
Zeeshan, I think we've lost you, if you can still hear us. We'll just wait for Zeeshan to reconnect. So while we wait for Zeeshan to come back, any thoughts from the discussants? I know we'll get to you, and you will be asking questions next, right? But while we still wait for Zeeshan, any views on what Zeeshan has just been talking about?
Gaurav, can I just go?
Please, Naraayan.
While Zeeshan talks about a large expat population from India, which inhabits almost all parts of the world, I don't see India being a big haven for refugees beyond a certain limit of people who already come in, maybe in the 60s and 70s. We are not seen as the promised land the same way that the other countries are seen who do enjoy a lot of power. Now, set aside the CAA-related issues. When there was a civil war in Syria, the Syrians were forced to cross the Mediterranean into Europe. But they didn't want to come to India, or India did not want to take them en masse. So I'm saying, isn't that also an avenue where we can show a little bit more of willingness and power?
Yes, I guess India has taken on refugees in the past, right? If you recall the creation of Bangladesh, and we've had some refugees come in from Myanmar as well from time to time, right? Not just the Rohingyas, but others as well. So it is there.
No numbers.
But yes, it is. But the fact is, I think, when you look at places like the Middle East, naturally for economic reasons, Europe is more attractive to those refugees, right? And they also tend to have family connections and other things there, right? So I think it's a combination of the economic opportunities and also family connections, I guess, right? But again, yes, there is definitely, it's something to think about, right? But yes, in the past, when it comes to Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, I do believe that yes, we've had refugee inflows as well, right? So okay, Deepali.
Yeah, I had a question regarding the UNSC seat. So you mentioned that, right now, if we look at UN's work, like actually Zeeshan mentioned that, if you look at UN's work, then most of it goes into, Africa. And coming from that, right now, the level at which we are as a country, should we first, we have our limitations and constraints when it comes to the economic aspect as well as the political aspect and the capacity constraint of the number of diplomats we have in our foreign services. So should we focus our energy towards building connections with the developed world where we are more benefited by the situation than, or with the, let's say the less developed than us, so that we are able to build a political influence and capital in that area. I mean, that is something that is a conflict for India, I feel, and choosing a direction would be important.
True. And I think my apologies. I think Zeeshan in his book tries to advocate that we do both of those things, not just one of them, right? We try to build those relationships with the developed countries, but also at the same time ensure that we establish strong connects with the developing countries. And his argument is that doing this will actually enhance our influence with the developed countries as well, right? It will put us in a position where India will become more imperative in exploring solutions to regional and global problems, right? So I think that's one of the courses that Zeeshan is advocating in terms of Indian foreign policy. There. Right?
So he's back. He's just connected back.
I'm right back. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. Great.
Sorry
to
about
have you back.
that.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is now we'll get the discussants to ask you a few questions, and we'll start with Ruturaj. So Ruturaj, over to you.
Yeah. Hi, Zeeshan. You've talked about this in your book as well, that India historically has enjoyed a lot of soft power. It could be our non-violent credentials, from our freedom movement to our diaspora, to our diplomats actually having more proficiency in English, and that has also helped. But we are also notoriously famous for fence sitting. And do you think this could be that at the end of the day, hard power in terms of economic might or military might is actually required to, stand your ground on the international arena? And do you think it will change as we become military more powerful or economically more powerful, or we need a thorough, overhauling of a strategic thought to really get over this fence sitting? What do you think about this?
No, this is a very, very good question. My short answer is no to both. And I'll tell you why. So, in my book, I talk about the fact that there are countries that are, powerful because of their economy. There are countries that are powerful because of their military. There are countries that in some sense are also influential because of, other political factors. Norway, for instance, is a very, very effective mediator and peacemaker in places like Sri Lanka and Afghanistan and elsewhere. Each country actually plays to its own strength. So in India's case, I don't think we actually suffer from a shortage of hard power at all. We are a nuclear power state. At least at any rate, other countries do not think of us as pushovers. I don't probably speak for China. But most parts of the world actually do think of India as being, the third largest military, a nuclear weapon state, and also because of our sheer size, very, very consequential to the global economy, whether we are poor or corrupt or hungry and illiterate or whatever else it is. Simply by virtue of being as large as we are, as a consumer base and as a workforce, we are extremely important to the rest of the world. But the other side of this is, you asked whether as India becomes a richer country, whether our influence is going to grow. Again, the answer is no, it may or may not grow. And that again depends on whether we use that, as a tool of foreign policy to build our influence around the world. Because, countries simply by virtue of, becoming richer, and more consequential do not become important to international issues unless we take a stand on those issues, on those said issues. And if a country sits on the fence and it is large and important, I write in my book that actually that country ends up losing its influence because countries on both sides of the conflict or the debate, whatever that conflict or debate is, they become suspicious of this country. They look at this country and they say it is so large and consequential, and yet we're not sure what they really stand for. So, can we cut a deal with them today? Are they going to backstab us tomorrow? Can we trust them if we cut a deal with them today? And so on and so forth. So, in fact, in some sense, becoming a large power or having a large amount of hard power, actually, or even soft power for that matter, actually makes it more incumbent on a country or an emerging power to take a stand on issues. Otherwise, it becomes a bystander at best. And at worst, it is somebody that you just cannot trust if you're on either side of the fence.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Right. I guess I have the next question for you.
Go ahead, Deepali, please.
Yeah. So I guess in the book you've pointed out some of the agreements India has signed with Nepal and Bhutan, limiting their autonomy in matters related to defense and procurement of weapon systems. So you also know that other aspects of India's dealings with its neighbors indicate that India primarily views them mainly as potential defense security problems that need containment, and not as growth partners. So, given this distrust and insecurity, how can India convince its neighborhood that its emergence as a global power will actually benefit them? Your views on that?
No, this is very important, and I think for me it's one of the most important issues in Indian foreign policy, because the neighborhood in many ways actually holds the veto vote, if you will, on India's rise as a global leader and a global power. If the neighborhood actually ends up becoming liabilities, then India is not going to be able to do much in terms of meeting its own interests, whether it is in South Asia or in the rest of the world. In fact, in many ways, it's easier to build influence in Africa or in Latin America that is so far removed than it is to build influence in South Asia. And that's why when Gaurav talked about whether we should be focusing more on South Asia than on Africa or the Middle East, that makes logical sense. But the fact of the matter is that it's actually easier in some sense for India to become involved in Africa and the Middle East, where we do not hold so much of historical baggage, and in some sense already hold a certain amount of goodwill because of our past as a colonial, a colonized country, and as a developing country on the world stage. And so South Asia is really probably the biggest problem, I think, in Indian foreign policy. And a lot of these wounds are also self-inflicted, I'm sorry to say, because things are already quite badly stacked against India. India is the largest country in the neighborhood by far. I draw comparisons to Indonesia in Southeast Asia. India is a lot larger in South Asia than Indonesia is in Southeast Asia. And also India is geographically located right in the center. So, in some sense, other countries cannot collaborate with each other unless they go through India in some sense, at least geographically. And so, a lot of our neighbors are obviously quite naturally suspicious of who we are and what we are. And they would like to counterbalance us. If we were them, we would certainly counterbalance ourselves with another country, because we did that during the Cold War. And that's exactly what the rest of South Asia is now doing with India by, in some sense, pulling China into the ring and signing treaties and deals with them. And the only way to get over this is to build that trust, as we mentioned, and to bridge that gap. And that is very, very difficult. Enormous amount of philanthropy and statesmanship across governments, across generations for a long period of time. This is a long-term project. You're not going to win the Nobel Peace Prize by being prime minister for 1 or 2 terms and being done with it. You need to lay the groundwork today so that somebody 15, 20 years down the line is able to build that trust enough so that the rest of the neighborhood actually sees that, look, India has been demonstrating that they mean good and they mean well, and their treaties show that, their words show that, their actions show that. And that is when I think India is going to be able to get over this hurdle.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Naraayan, would you like to go with the next one?
Zeeshan, thanks for saying backstabbing and distrust, because I think China has already taken over those 2 aspects completely. Let me come to the 2 words that most of us really dislike, strategic autonomy, which I think is just a euphemism for nothing but non-aligned, and which has continued in a different way, barring the phase that Indira Gandhi was in charge and maybe the Gujarat Doctrine. So this conception of strategic autonomy is regarded as one of the core principles of our foreign policy right now. And maybe this is perhaps one of the reasons why India avoids taking a clear, unambiguous position on many issues. I mean, we have a host of flip-flops. Can we first agree, my question number one is, can we first agree this has not succeeded to produce intended outcomes, or rather failed? I would rather say it's failed. And how relevant this strategic autonomy is going to be in the future, and what needs to change? Can we start taking a stand and perhaps align on certain issues with certain parties when it is to our benefit? I mean, that's what great powers do, don't they?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think we can agree that it has not, given us the dividends that we probably expected. And my preface makes that quite clear. India's influence on all of these indices is quite low. And so in some sense, I'm not sure what the objective of strategic autonomy was. But I also think that this term, in some sense, as you said, doesn't make as much sense to me. And I don't think it makes as much sense to the rest of the world. In the 1950s, maybe, but today it certainly doesn't, because again, a country as large and consequential as India cannot be anything but strategically autonomous. We're a country that America is willing to give us waiver on sanctions to, when they're not willing to do that for anybody else, and nobody any less hawkish than Donald Trump did that for India. And as one American diplomat put to me, when I was at the UN, you look at the way that India has been treated on the nuclear issue, even by America. Even Israel has not gotten the privilege that India has got in terms of its nuclear program being legitimized by America. And America actually standing up to its own allies and saying that India has done enough to merit a seat in the nuclear suppliers group, even though India has not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And a lot of US allies don't like this. And this is not just a one administration thing. America has been doing this for India over a period of time. And this is one of, quite rightly, people think of America as being a very snooty world power. But India's experience, in my view, has not been so much that. And that is largely to do with the fact that India is a very large, consequential country and cannot easily be pushed around by any emerging power or established global power. Because if they put sanctions on us, then they suffer as well. It's not just us. So I think the meaning of the term strategic autonomy, in some sense, I don't know exactly whom that is directed to. It certainly doesn't mean very much to the rest of the world. It probably means very much to the domestic audience. I honestly don't know what the objective of that policy really is. But it does hold us back, as you said, from standing up for issues that we should stand up for. Because what strategic autonomy in some sense does is that we watch what other countries do, what Russia says or what America says or what China says, and in some sense we're actually trying to balance ourselves between them and put ourselves somewhere in the middle. So we are reacting in some sense to what other countries are doing or saying, rather than standing up for ourselves and saying this is what India wants, regardless of what America says or China says or Russia says, and this is why we want it. So the way that we, I think, in my view, can get out of this paradigm or get out of fence sitting in some sense is to resolve the fundamental debates on what India should stand for. It's not quite clear, for instance, whether India should stand up for democracy and human rights around the world or whether we shouldn't. We tend to commit U-turns in Myanmar and Sri Lanka on the Tamils' rights issues. One government tends to say one thing, another government tends to say another thing sometimes. And the only way to actually get out of our fence-sitting mode is, in some sense, to build up a foundation on what Indian foreign policy should stand for. So, for instance, in the US, Democrats and Republicans disagree on a whole host of issues. But at least on paper, they tend to agree on what those core values of American foreign policy are, whether it's Donald Trump or anybody else. Donald Trump, in some sense, was an outsider to these things, was a rebel. But even people within the Republican Party, like George W. Bush, used to call him out when he was not standing up for democratic values in different parts of the world. So they do broadly agree on what America is or what American national power should stand for. But in India's case, we are not quite clear. And so as a result, we're not able to be consistent in our policy decisions.
Thanks, Zeeshan. Let's do one more round with the discussants, and we'll start off with Deepali this time.
Sure. Thanks, Gaurav. Taking it forward from your answer to Narayan's question, does India have a coherent strategic vision insofar as its foreign policy is concerned? And how would the changes in approach that you are advocating fit in with the broader strategic direction for the Indian foreign policy?
No, I mean, obviously, the reason that my book is called Flying Blind is it's twofold. One is that a country as large as India cannot crawl; it can only fly. So we are already flying. The rest of the world already sees India as an emerging power, whether we believe it or not. It's not like the rest of the world is conspiring against India to bring us down either. There is broadly consensus that India can be a responsible power because we have tended not to do too much of damage around the world. But we are blind in that, in some sense, as I said, we haven't decided what the fundamental tenets of Indian foreign policy should be. Outside of that, we will not take a stance, or that we will not allow America to tell us what stance we should take. We haven't really decided what stance we will take, regardless of whether America tells us or not, regardless of whether China likes it or not. And so that, I think, in many ways is the crux of the problem. India needs to figure out a foreign policy for itself and decide what stance it wants to take on important international questions. And it needs to do this on the basis of a bunch of coherent, consistent principles. So we cannot really say one thing in Syria and another thing in Myanmar, because then, again, as I said, that's not how you build trust and credibility on the world stage. And America itself has suffered a lot because of this, as I write in my book, due to its dilution of American foreign policy values during the Cold War. In many ways, America actually diluted its own credibility as a global power, and it has suffered for it. It has suffered for it in Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world. So India should not, make that mistake. I think India needs to learn from America's mistake and be more consistent and coherent in what it stands up for, so that it's able to build credibility with interest groups that look up to India to stand up for what matters to them. And that is how we build influence with them and then become an important political player in international politics.
Naraayan?
Zeeshan, one of the most important aspects of your book, and you begin with that, is that our passport has not much value when it comes to other countries. I think all of us here know the peril of applying for a UK visa or a Schengen visa, and the 160 pages that we have to submit, get treated like a criminal, get prodded. So do you think this is on account of the fact that India still has a relatively low per capita GDP, or do you think the foreign policy measures of the future? I mean, I know our administration has also spoken about this, that we will, become a more powerful country, our citizens will be treated better and things like that. But do you think this is going to change through institution building, avoiding fence sitting, or is there any other way that all of us will someday get perhaps visa on arrival when we land in Zurich?
I mean, income is obviously one of the factors that influence this. I'm not denying that at all. The fact that India has a very large population that is also impoverished and looking for opportunities abroad is one of the reasons why immigration control is somewhat tight for Indian workers and students when they go abroad. But at the same time, I think this is also caused, in my opinion, by the fact that India does not have enough bargaining chips and influence to talk to these countries and then negotiate an upper hand for ourselves on a lot of these issues. So if you look at the Henley Passport Index, for various reasons, countries that are actually poorer than India are also ranked above India. It also has to do with the neighborhood where they are situated in Africa and so on, that have a number of agreements amongst themselves. But it's also quite telling to me, I think at least, that India is ranked so low, and at least some part of this, in my opinion, should be remediable by India building its influence and building bargaining chips for itself in bilateral negotiations. China, for instance, was ranked much higher than India, even when it was at a fairly low per capita income level. And other countries likewise are the same. So it's not an excuse, in my opinion, that India can use. A lot of it also has to come down to the fact that India's diaspora is very important to the countries that they go to. There is no denying it. So that in itself should be, in fact, in many ways, a bargaining chip for India to use in these bilateral negotiations. The Middle East economy is heavily dependent on the Indian workforce, and that should be enough reason for them in many ways to treat our laborers better than to put them in concentration camps in Qatar and elsewhere, where even during COVID, as we saw, they did not have access to basic amenities and facilities, and they were basically left hanging and helpless, and the Indian government was not able to do much until quite late in terms of getting the host governments to behave better with the Indian diaspora. So it's an extremely unfortunate situation, and I think at least, if, for instance, in the Middle East, India becomes a lot more important to countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, one way or the other, whether we take the side of Iran or not, if we are able to swing the balance one way or the other and we become important and influential, I certainly think that these countries would look at these as bargaining chips for India, and India would be able to use these in times such as these, as America has done in the past. So I don't think income is an excuse; it's a factor, but it shouldn't really be an excuse anymore for a country as large and consequential as India is.
And just to mention, on the flip side, we roll out the red carpet for many of these countries.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that is a huge imbalance. India, gives visa on arrival, I think, to close to 100 countries, if not more. I've written the data in my book. Yes. But in return, we only get visa on arrival from 51 countries, if I'm not wrong. So there is a huge imbalance there for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks. So we'll do one quick question, and let's keep it really brief from Ruturaj, and then we'll come to a few audience questions before we close.
Yeah. Hi, Zeeshan. So in India, our general elections are hardly ran on the plank of foreign policy, and one reason could be it is considered to be an elite domain, and this could be because all the conversations are happening in English. But when I read your book and you and other writings, your writing is very approachable. So do you think in order to create an informed citizenry, there's a need to have these discussions in Indian languages, and do you plan to translate your works in maybe first in Hindi and then other major Indian languages in the near future?
Yeah, this is an excellent point. And actually, during the launch of our book in Jan, Shashi Tharoor made this point. He said that foreign policy discussions tend to be extremely dominated by the Delhi circle. And he said that, as MOSC oftentimes tried to make an effort to, take this conversation to places like Kochi and Shillong and elsewhere, which I found quite commendable myself. And I think that point is very valid because, as I said, Indian foreign policy is much more important than just an academic debate or discussion for a few people to be had in Delhi or in the South Bloc. It certainly needs to be talked about by the farmers, the factory workers, I said, the fishermen, the students, the workers, the professionals, the businessmen, the investors, the traders, and so on, regardless of what income group they are in, because it is just such an important issue for India's holistic, inclusive development at all levels and in all ways. So certainly this conversation, it does frustrate me that this conversation doesn't go out further into the Indian hinterland and reach the masses and the rural areas. And that is why I actually did a podcast interview with Ajtak when the book came out, even though I'm not one who is all that comfortable with Hindi, and it was the first time that I actually spoke in public in Hindi. But I felt it important enough to actually speak about foreign policy to the Hindi audience as well. And I certainly do want to do that with the Tamil and Kannada audiences, languages that I speak. In terms of translating this book, it's only something that Penguin, the publisher, can answer. I certainly would personally like to see it translated over a period of time at any rate, because I think that the issues that I've raised are not issues that are relevant to this year or the next, but issues that would be relevant to India's foreign policy and domestic development, I hope, for the decades ahead, because I've tried to take a more long-term view and perspective on a lot of these things. So I certainly do hope, and I certainly also do hope that more young people actually try and write about these things in English and also in other languages, in Hindi and Kannada and Oriya and Assamese and so on, to get the word out and at the very least spark debate. If not, try to convince them on what is right and wrong. I myself, in my book, write that I don't have all the answers to a lot of the questions that I pose. But the key objective that I have in my mind is to get the Indian audience and the Indian voter to start asking these fundamental questions on what Indian foreign policy is, and what its purpose should be and what objectives it should fulfill in order to meet the dreams and aspirations of the common Indian people.
Thanks, Zeeshan. Since we have only a few minutes, let's quickly go to a few of the audience questions. And we've had a lot of great questions from the audience. So I'm just selecting 2 or 3. I'm sure you'll look at the others and find a way to respond to those as well. So the first question I'll request you to respond to is from Aditi. She asks, how do you think we can foster a common set of core values for Indian foreign policy? And how do you think we can encourage statesmanship that can build trust with neighbors, as you just spoke of?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I'm not going to reveal all of the answer because a lot of it is a very long story and it's taken pages and pages in my book. For me, the unconventional opinion that I really, in many ways share in my book, the United States has as much of an interest in standing up for democratic values and human rights around the world as India does. And I say this for both soft and hard power reasons. There are very, very strategic, cold and calculative reasons for why India should stand up for democracy and human rights on the world stage and around the world, and without exception, whether it's the Rohingyas in Myanmar, or the Tamils in Sri Lanka, or the Hong Kong protesters, or the Lebanese protesters, or the Syrians under Assad, or the Iranians under the Iranian regime, whatever it is, wherever there is a human rights violation taking place, I think it is in India's very strong strategic interest to stand up for these values and rights. And there are several reasons for why I say that, and they're all documented and explained in great detail in my book. So that for me is a starting point. But even if people do not agree with what I'm saying here, I think it still is important that we are consistent in what we say and what we speak. China is very, very consistent. China speaks for sovereignty, state sovereignty. They speak even for authoritarianism and one-party states very, very consistently, whether that is in Sri Lanka or the Maldives or in Zimbabwe or in Ethiopia. And in the China chapter of my book, I talk about several political training programs that the Chinese Communist Party has held, including through official, channels of the Chinese Foreign Ministry in various countries around the world to develop its ideals of sovereignty and state-run bureaucracy and state capitalism and one-party states and so on. Ethiopia is the biggest example that comes to mind, which I have quoted in my book, but there are also other examples around the world where China has done this. And so when China talks about state sovereignty, whether it's in the case of Assad or in the case of Iran or in the case of Libya, it's not just loose talk. It's very, very strategically calculated. There are strong political and economic reasons for why they do that. And they do that without exception in every part of the world. They have never stood up for talking about democracy in any part of the world, and for good reason, as I argue in my book. So India also needs to be consistent in what it stands for. If we as a country decide that democracy doesn't matter anywhere in the world, we should be speaking like China does. That's the only way for us to be credible. But there are very real reasons, political and economic, that I write about in my book, why India cannot do this credibly, and why India at some point in time is going to take a U-turn. And that's what has essentially happened in different countries like Sri Lanka and others. Whenever there's been a change in government or there has been a change in domestic politics, India has changed its policies. So the argument that I make is one that is consistent with India's domestic political and economic interests and what it needs from the rest of the world. And that is why I think India should stand up for democracy and human rights and
Thank you, Zeeshan. I think we've lost you there. Let's see if we can have you back. We are out of time, but if you can still hear us, there is one last question that I'll cover, and this is from Bhagirath, and I'll also combine this with a question from Pranay. Right. So Bhagirath asks, isn't it true that today's leading foreign powers are yesterday's imperialist powers? China is emerging as the first colonial challenger. What should India's strategy be in this scenario? And Pranay's question, which I will add on to this, is about how you view the impact of US-China competition on India, and how do you see it playing out, right? So I know that's a lot to pack into one question, but it would be a good one to conclude with.
No, both are very, very interesting questions. I mean, look, I think colonialism, in my view, for all practical purposes, is long gone. We like to talk about it for romantic reasons and so on, and it's good to talk about history, but I think we should be careful about overplaying its significance and importance in international politics. People do think and talk about colonialism in places like Ethiopia, Nigeria, and so on, in many ways because they think that they are poor because of it, and that is a very valid reason. But I think the rest of the world has also started to move on from this in very large part, which is why you see protests happening in every other part of the post-colonial world every day. If people thought that everything was because of colonialism and nothing can be fixed, they wouldn't be protesting against the government of the day. Obviously they're siding with the establishment because that's what the establishment tends to say, put the blame on something that's happened in the past in a lot of these countries. So I think colonialism as such, as a concept in international politics, is no longer quite as important. And China's rise is in many ways an example really to me, or proof of that really to me, that colonialism in some way is receding in terms of its importance in global power distribution. I think power is most certainly now, global power is certainly now moving from west to east. The West also recognizes that Joe Biden, despite his policy of returning America to a position of leadership on the world stage, does not envision America as a unipolar state the way that Bill Clinton or George W. Bush would have been forgiven for thinking of America as. America, even as early as Barack Obama, had started withdrawing from the world stage. It's not something that Donald Trump started. It was certainly something he did in a much more radical manner, in a much more noisy manner, in a much more haphazard, ad hoc manner. But it is, I think, a part of American foreign policy now that America starts ceding the stage in some sense to a more multipolar world. And it would like to build alliances with countries around the world with whom it has shared interests and also common enemies, in terms of competition from China. And India is one of those countries that America sees as part of its huge wide network of alliances that would include, of course, Australia and Japan and Europe and Britain and so on. India is very unique, I think, in this network of alliances that America is trying to build, because India is a part of the East, but it's also a part of the West. in that our political system is inherently Western. Our democracy is inherently Western. Our culture is increasingly globalized, much more globalized than, say, the cultures of countries like China or Japan or South Korea or Singapore. Perhaps not Singapore, but but other East Asian countries. Our people listen to a lot more Western music. They read a lot more Western literature. We speak a lot more English than any of these countries, and all for very good reason. And so, in some sense, I think India is either a kind of a Western country in Eastern clothes, if you will, and so straddling both worlds. And I think that, in some sense, has made India a much more important ally to America in its worldview than even, say, countries like Japan or South Korea, because America, in some sense, is able to culturally relate to India a lot better than Americans would to the Japanese or the Koreans. But I think that on the Indian foreign policy side of this, obviously, as is the case with most other broad questions, there is a certain sense of confusion. Some of that confusion is being allayed after the confrontation with China. The confusion was whether India should stand neutral between America and China. And so when China started acting as an enemy on the Himalayan border, India obviously started to think that, okay, this is a challenge, we should probably ally with America. But now that the détente has started taking place on the border in the Himalayas with China, my gut feeling is that India is going to start getting cold feet again on Quad exercises. That is not a workout regime, of course, but the alliance with America and Japan and Australia to counter China in some sense. India is going to start getting cold feet on trying to rub China the wrong way on issues that India was starting to speak up on against China in the past. And the pattern is, in some sense, that every 2 or 3 years, China comes in, India starts thinking, okay, this is a challenge, let's start allying with America. And then 4 or 5 months down the line, there's a détente, Wuhan Spirit takes place. The prime minister shake hands in China or in India. And then suddenly India becomes a strategically autonomous, non-aligned state. And then 3 years down the line, again, China comes in and the cycle repeats itself. So I'd actually predicted that there would be a détente, even before the détente took place. If you guys listen to my interview with Ajtak, which took place back in January, I said, don't worry about the China situation. A détente is on its way very, very soon. De-escalation will take place because it happened the last time that this happened in Doklam. It happened when it took place in Arunachal. It happened when it took place in Ladakh a few years ago as well. There's no reason why it's not going to take place again. So China likes to keep India confused in some sense. And that is why, in my view, as I also argue in my book, China tends to use the Himalayas as a way to keep India confused and keep India non-aligned, so to speak, in this war. And they use the carrot and stick approach to keep India in some way neither in that camp nor in this camp. And as a result, also India becomes irrelevant to the balance of power. And that is how China benefits, because China knows that in terms of core interests, America and India are fairly quite aligned in most parts of global governance and other parts of the world. So keeping India outside of America's camp by keeping India confused in this manner is very much in China's interest, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Well, thanks, Zeeshan. It's been a very illuminating discussion. It gives us a lot of food for thought. Unfortunately, we are out of time completely. So I also want to just thank Naraayan, Deepali, and Ruturaj for being discussants today. And of course, thanks very much to the audience for your insights and questions. So again, the book is called Flying Blind and India's Quest for Global Leadership. And I would urge you all to get a copy and read it. Thanks very much. Have a great evening and a nice weekend.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.